So today I would like to share our recent work on comprehension of core grammar in diverse samples of Mandarin acquiring preschool children with SD. And this study was completed in Central South University, and you can see my background. Actually, I'm giving you my talk in this building, which we have conducted some of the experiments here. Now I want to divide this talk into 4 parts. Firstly, I want to talk about the new exploration of the language faculty in autism spectrum disorder, because this is a very new direction in autistic language acquisition. And number 2, I want to share with you our current Mandarin IPL studies, which is about the core grammar in Mandarin acquiring preschool children with SD. And then I'm going to discuss the role of the language faculty in autistic language acquisition. And finally, I'm going to share with you the research implications and as well as the future directions. So now, first of all, now let's look at the language faculty in autism spectrum disorder. So firstly, what is a language faculty? If you major in linguistics, you will know that according to Professor Noam Chomsky, this actually is a very classic terminology or concept in linguistics, or more specifically in the universal grammar framework. So the language faculty is an autonomous, generatively determined module of the brain that subserves language. It includes a computational system that generates internal syntactic representations and maps them into the sensory motor and conceptual intentional interface systems. At the same time, it has specific brain structures and operates independently from other cognitive systems, at least according to the previous concept of language faculty. Although I know that for the moment, we have a lot of discussion about the interaction between the language faculty and other cognitive systems. And number 3, it contains autonomous domains like phonology, lexicon, syntax, semantics, with linguistic information processed separately in different domains. So in previous work among typical developing children, we have a lot of evidence that typical developing children, they acquire core aspects of human languages. And they have their core, like universal grammar principles of parameters at the early stage of language development, and across different language communities. So children learning different languages, they have the knowledge of universal principles or parameters or other universal mechanisms of language acquisition. And so there are lots of studies, and these studies prove that we have the assistance of a biologically endowed language faculty in typical language development, because TD children or typical developing children, they acquire core aspects of human languages at the early stage of language acquisition and across different language communities. And also in clinical populations with cognitive or language disorders, like children or clinical populations with aphasia, Williams syndrome, developmental language development. Previous study also suggest that they show dissociation between linguistic abilities and other non-linguistic cognitive abilities. So this dissociation also testifies the modularity of the language faculty independent of other cognitive systems. But so far, very few studies have discussed the role of the language faculty in language acquisition of children with SD. Now let me, before I tell you before I maybe share with you my visions about the reasons why we don't have so much study about the language faculty in children with SD, we can see something about this very special clinical population. So children with SD, they have two defining diagnostic symptoms. Number one, they have social interaction challenges. They have very fewer and shorter social interaction with people around. They have a less frequent eye contact. Also, they have less triadic joint attention with other people. So they have the first diagnosing symptom, that is they have social interaction challenges. And number two, they also have repetitive stereotype behaviors. They focus on detail, they focus on similes, they focus on idiosyncratic interests and activities. So I can show you this video and you can see clearly our children on the child on the left. This is a typical development the typical development child, and the child on the right is a child at risk with autism. So you can show the differences of these two children. So I'm going to click the video.
In this example, both children are intrigued by the bubbles and want more. The typical child goes about trying to find out how to get more from the bottle, the source. The child at risk shows no social or communicative attempt to request help, almost content to let the bubbles continue or to do without.
Okay, so you can see they are very different with respect to their social interactions with the outside world of people. So although for the moment, language disorder is not listed as one of the diagnosing symptoms of children with SD, however, language delay is the primary cause for hospital referrals by preschool children with SD. So we can see a lot of children or young children with SD, they have language delay, and that is a reason that parents will send them to the hospital to seek actually whether they have some psychiatric disorders or not. So although that we have mentioned, we see the discussion of the role of language faculty in clinical populations like Williams syndrome or developmental language disorder, but so far few studies have discussed the role of the language faculty in autistic language acquisition. So why is that? I think the first reason, as you can see from the video, because social deficit is same intrinsically involved in any language difficulties that are observed in SD. So we think that maybe language development or impairment in this population can be accounted by the support from or lack of social mechanisms in SD. So we don't know the role of language faculty in these children with SD's language development, because their social deficits as a core diagnostic symptom of this population. So a lot of their language impairment can be accounted by the support of the lack of social mechanisms in ASD. And number two, because ASD represents a heterogeneous group of socially based neurodevelopmental disorders, the enormous heterogeneity in language development has challenged any attempt to achieve a unified account of autistic language acquisition. So we have a study of Chinese children with SD. We tested their language or their language development, or more specifically expressive language development, using 普通话 communicative language inventory. And we have found, as I mentioned, they have very severe language delay. They're about 2.5 years behind TD children in expressive language. And also we find great heterogeneity in language in developmental rate. We can define this 160 children with SD into 3 groups. So the majority of them actually are low verbal, and with some maybe no more than half of the population are middle verbal or high verbal. So they have great differences in developmental rate. And then also we found heterogeneity in speech contact. So some of them have strengths in lexical and grammatical uses, but actually most of them would have problems with the use of decontextualized language. And we think that is an early sign of their lack of usage of pragmatic knowledge to communicate about what's going on outside the current situation. So now let's also compare the speech of typical developing children and the children with SD. As you can see on the left, this is a video about a TD child, 33 months old. And we can see the interaction with the mother. I can show you the video.
背起来，把它推倒，好不好？这样不对。这样不对呀，那应该怎么？要放好是吧？这样。就跟它一模一样好。这样。这样好。
So, so you can see on this video is about this TD child, and then on the right we have this video about this child with SD.
然后我们把它一致性的把它推倒啊，对，摆起来，对，摆起来，一致性的推倒，对，摆起来，把它推倒。
So when we compare the speech of these two children, we can see the TD child can actually lead his mother to do whatever he wants to do. So his speech is very creative and context appropriate. And this child with SD, he just repeated this 推倒 several times. So his speech is quite broad and routinized. So I think there's another reason why field studies have discussed the role of language faculty in autism language acquisition, because when we look at the speech data, especially from preschool children with SD, they seem to apply rote learning a lot in their speech. So we may have the question about whether language faculty really assist language acquisition in preschool children with SD. Well, although so far few studies have discussed the role of language faculty in autism language acquisition, but actually we have some improvements recently, because two recent theoretical accounts have proposed a possible contribution of the language faculty in a typical language development. These two studies are not focusing on children with SD per se, but they include the case of ASD. So one study by Smith and simply mentioned that children with SD's atypical development may reside primarily in pragmatics, but not formal language. But actually, this is also the general agreement in the field that children with SD actually they have great impairment in pragmatics, but maybe not formal language. I'm going to show you more empirical studies about this later. And Smith and simply mentioned that such dissociation contributes to the theoretical distinction between narrow syntax and the syntax discourse of pragmatics interfaces. And also, another study by Levada and his colleagues proposed a locus preservation hypothesis, which predicted the resilience of the computational part of the human language faculty across developmental disorders, including the case of ASD. Now, moreover, this study has highlighted the importance of cross-linguistic approach, which may help to explore the shared linguistic profiles and the vulnerable linguistic parts in different development disorders across languages. So these are some of the theoretical papers discussing the possible contribution of language faculty in atypical language acquisition, including ASD, and also previous studies in empirical studies in English acquiring preschoolers with ASD have actually identified typical patterns, processes, mechanisms of grammatical acquisition, like what I mentioned in Smith and the simplest conclusion that these children may have grammatical strengths which indicate the operation of a language faculty in autistic language acquisition. So I'm going to show you two important groups of studies. So one group of study have been conducted by Professor Helen Tuck-Flasberg and her colleagues. So these are longitudinal studies of language production in high functioning verbal autistic boys and compared with children with Down syndrome and normal children reported in the literature. And they have found their dissociation in their production between grammatical form and communicative functions. So they have strengths in producing grammatical forms, but they have impairments in communicative functions. So Professor Helen Tuck-Flasberg mentioned that development of her grammatical form is in a relatively normal fashion, and that appears to be largely independent of social influences, though communicative function is at the core of the autistic syndrome. And also, she also mentioned the more formal aspects of language depend on separate computational mechanisms that are specific to the domain of the language. However, she didn't explicitly discuss the role of language faculty in autistic language acquisition, although they have found that children with autism, they have strengths with grammatical, maybe with producing grammatical forms, but they haven't actually related this phenomena to the role of language faculty in autistic language acquisition. And also another study is about language comprehension. This is a 20-year long, more than 20-year longitudinal studies of early language conducted by Professor Letitia Lagos and her colleagues in University of Connecticut. So assess fears are a movement measure of intermodal prevention looking at 2 to 5 year old English acquiring children SD. So have demonstrated comprehension of core grammatical structures like SVO, word order, grammatical aspect, and WH questions. They also exhibited the typical acquisition mechanism of syntactic bootstrapping. So children can use their abstract syntactic frames to actually comprehend the meanings of lower verbs. And they also, the children with SD also follow the typical acquisition process of comprehension preceding production. Thus, the conclusion is that grammatical deficits in language used by children with SD may result from their social disinterest in conversations rather than represent fundamental grammatical impairments. However, this set of studies also haven't explicitly discussed the role of language faculty in autistic language acquisition. So in addition to these two English, actually not two, to the previous English studies, which may have the indication of, children with these grammatical strengths, so what about cross-linguistic grammatical studies? Do we have evidence for language faculty from cross-linguistic grammatical studies in children with ASD? So I think cross-linguistic studies start maybe not so long as English studies, because English studies can be traced back to 1970s or 80s. But here, for most cross-linguistic studies, we just start in the past decade. So like in Greek, Terzi author has reported that 5 to 8-year-old high-functioning Greek-speaking children with SD didn't differ from TD children in interpreting reflexives, strong pronouns, or long-active morphology, but they have difficulties with comprehending or producing clitics. And in French, Durman author has investigated the contribution of complex syntax, such as sentence complement comprehension, to theory of mind development among 6 to 16-year-old high-functioning French-speaking children with SD. In Dutch, Scheffer and her colleagues has investigated 5 to 14-year-old high-functioning Dutch-speaking children with SD, and they found that they have difficulty with article choice and direct object scrambling, and also in Mandarin Chinese. So strengths have been observed in sentence comprehension that high-functioning children with SD older than 4 years, they accurately distinguish sentences with different word order, W questions, logical words, but they also have deficits in production and comprehension of morphosyntax. So far, when we look at the cross-linguistic data, we can see that actually this data, mostly they focus on high-functioning children with SD. So they also focus on children older than 4-year-olds. So these children with SD demonstrate grammatical strengths in basic or core grammar of human languages. So indicating the word order structures and logical concepts in Mandarin Chinese, which indicate the operation of language faculty in autistic language acquisition. But at the same time, children may be affected by computational complexity in acquiring complex grammar, including embedded courses or movement structures. And also they seem to have difficulties with grammatical structures that involve the use of pragmatic knowledge. And also some studies have shown the interactions between grammatical knowledge and extra-linguistic cognitive factors like false belief, reasoning, working memory, phonological memory, executive functions, etc. Well, to summarize, despite all these enumerated studies in previous and recent English studies of children with SD and also cross-linguistic English studies, we found that few studies have explicitly or systematically investigated the role of language faculty in autistic language acquisition. And also, few studies have directly compared grammatical knowledge of children with SD across languages using similar methodology. And also most of the cross-linguistic studies, as I have mentioned, they focus on high-functioning children with SD older than 4 years of age. So we don't know whether grammatical strengths can be seen in children with SD across the spectrum and in early stage of language development, for example, in Mandarin Chinese. So now let's see our recent study in Mandarin preschool children with SD. So we use the IPL measures similar to previous studies among English acquiring preschoolers with SD. And we investigated comprehension of 3 core grammatical structures as word order, grammatical aspects, W questions in diverse samples of 2 to 6-year-old children with SD acquiring Mandarin Chinese. So for our participants, now actually we have a much larger sample than the previous English studies. So we have 3 diverse groups of 2 to 6-year-old Mandarin acquiring children with SD, and also younger TD controls, but they are unmatched or expressive language levels. So for their age, TD children are significantly younger than children with SD. for their autism behavior checklist scores, children with SD have much higher ABC scores. So they have much severe autistic symptoms. And then for vocabulary, our typical developing children, they have a significantly larger vocabulary size than children with SD. And also similarly, they have a much higher mean length of 3 longest sentence utterances scores than children with SD. So, well, to summarize, for our participants, we have unmatched groups of these 2 participant groups. So they differ from previous English IPL studies. So most of the previous IPL studies have participants matched with their TDE controls based on their vocabulary production scores. And also our participants differ from prior cross-linguist studies, mostly with high-functioning children with SD older than 4 years of age. So our participants with SD were younger, lower verbal, and lower functioning. And this sample is representative, as I have shown you the previous study using PCDI. So this sample, so our diverse sample of children with SD, actually, they are representative of the general population of children with SD in China. Because our children with SD, they were not matched with TD controls, and specifically they have much lower vocabulary production scores than our TD controls. So this enables us to investigate the early lexical-grammatical relationship in ASD. In particular, we can investigate the question, which is also classic language acquisition question, whether children with SD lack a critical mass of vocabulary to construct their grammar or not. Now, because remember, if I say our sample is representative of the general Chinese population of children with SD, and then we have a large sample of low verbal children with SD. So we can ask this question, so whether children with SD, whether they need a critical mass of a vocabulary to construct their grammar or not. So as mentioned, we have used the eye movement measure of intermodal provincial looping paradigm. This is what has been used in previous English IPL studies, and children watch side-by-side videos paired with linguistic stimulus that matches only one of the visual presentations, and also the child's eye movements were coded offline by coders blind to the matching sign. And the stimulus videos include control trials with long directive audio, like 看两边都有, so long directive, and the test trials with a directive audio, like 小马在推小鸟, so that's test trial. So because this is an eye movement measure, so this reduces communication and attention challenges in ASD. So the child do not have to communicate with the experimenters or even their parents. So they just watch the videos, and then we measure if they comprehend the linguistic structures by looking at their eye movement data. And for the grammatical structures tested, so we also tested, like in previous English studies, we tested SVO word order, 小鸟在拉小马. And also, but Mandarin Chinese is very different from English. Briefly, I cannot extend this, well, the differences about word orders between Mandarin Chinese and English, but I just briefly mentioned the canonical word order in Mandarin Chinese is SVO, just like English. However, Mandarin Chinese also allows various word orders and ellipses of long arguments. So this differs from English, a strict SVO language. And for our study 2, we tested grammatical aspect like 他洗了娃娃. So the perfective marker 了 and 他在洗娃娃 the progressive marker 在. So in Mandarin Chinese, we do not have a lot of morphosyntactic systems, but I know English is not so rich as well. But in Mandarin Chinese, grammatical aspect is a special kind of morphology-like device that can be separate from the verb, and they differ from English that use inflectional morpheme to express tense and aspects. And in many of the English sentences, the usage of inflectional morphemes are optional. So they have to use these morphemes, that grammatical aspect, to express tense or aspect, but that's not the situation in Mandarin Chinese. And in study 3, we tested children's knowledge of WH questions, like 小鸟报了什么 or subject W question. Object W question, 小鸟报了什么 or 什么报了小鸟, subject W question. And one of the most important typological features of Mandarin Chinese is being a WH in situ language, which differ from English, a WH movement language. So actually, although we have very similar grammatical structures as in previous English studies, but actually we also have very special properties in Mandarin Chinese which make our study very, maybe can enumerate the differences of these two languages to see whether the differences will impact language development of children with SD. So now let's see our research questions. We have 3 research questions in our IPL studies. So in order to investigate the role of language faculty in autistic language acquisition, so we asked the first question, do Mandarin acquiring preschoolers with SD comprehend grammatical structures in a similar pattern as those with typical development? And number 2, do Mandarin acquiring preschoolers with SD acquire grammatical structure in a similar pattern as what has been reported among English acquiring preschool children with SD? And because our children are different from previous English studies, they are not matched with TD children on their vocabulary. So we asked within the language module, what's the relationship between the linguistic subcomponents of lexicon and grammar? So specifically, do children with SD need some vocabulary knowledge to construct their grammar, or we can see the dissociation between the domain of lexicon and grammar. So here are our major findings of our studies. So for the first one, comprehension, we find comprehension strengths of SVO word order. So for the test sentence, 小鸟在拉小马. So if you understand the test sentence, you look at the left screen, the left video. So we can find that both TD children and children with SD look longer at the match during test relative to control trials. But TD children look longer to the match during, so they look at the matching side here, then the control trial, so which just say look at both springs, 看两边都有. So TD children look longer to the match during first half of the test trial, so they have speedy SVO understanding. But children with SD, they look longer to the match during second half of the control of the test trials. So they have slower but reliable understanding of SVO. So we also look at their online processing data, and we found that Mandarin acquiring children preschoolers with SD, they were less efficient in online processing of SVO order than TD children, because TD children look first to the matching screen. And also maintain this preference for the first half of the test trial. However, children with SD, they demonstrated a sustained look to the match during the second half of the test trials. So they differ in their processing efficiency. Children with SD were less efficient in online processing of SVO or word order than TD children. And number two, these are our results of comprehension strengths of, or we also found comprehension for our second study. We also found comprehension strengths of grammatical aspect, like 他洗了娃娃 or 他在洗娃娃. So when they heard 他洗了娃娃, you can look at the completed event, or 他在洗娃娃, you would look at the ongoing event. And we found both groups look significantly more at the completed events. So you can see that completed events, they look more at completed event for the Le test trials for both groups, but not for Zai trials. So both groups were, and also we find the differences between the looking patterns to the completed action or the events. So when they hear these two audios, so one with Le and the other with Zai, so both groups were able to map aspectual morphemes Le and Zai onto their distinct meanings. So when we heard Le, they would look more at their completed events. But when they heard Zai, so that is an imperfective marker, they wouldn't look away from the completed event. And similar data have been reported by my student Xie Qian in her BUCLD proceeding with the perfective marker Le and the durative marker Zhe. And we also, for the W questions, 小鸟抱了什么? Now object W question and 什么抱了小鸟? Subject WH question. So 小鸟抱了什么? So if you understand 小鸟抱了什么, you would look at this horse. So TD children, they comprehended both object and subject WH questions. So subject W question, 什么抱了小马? You would look at the bird, because they look significantly less to the named character during the WH question trials. So relative to the Lali, so I haven't mentioned the Lali question trial, this trial are sentences like 哪里有小马, 哪里有小鸟. So they look at, for example, 小鸟抱了什么, and the comparisons 哪里有小鸟. So when they heard 小鸟抱了什么, so they look significantly less to the named character during 小鸟抱了什么 than relative to 哪里有小鸟. This kind of control trials. And for children with SD, they comprehend the object W questions, but not the subject W questions. So they show the ease of object over subject WH questions in ASD. And then about the lexical grammatical relationship, we found that comprehension of SVO word order in children with SD was correlated to the total vocabulary production scores on PCDI. However, comprehension of grammatical aspect of W questions showed no significant correlations with vocabulary production scores in children with SD. And also we found that some of the minimally verbal children showed comprehension of grammatical structures. So in our 3 experiments, about 70% to 21% of the total SD sample, they were found to understand their target structures. So here is you can see the scatter plot of SVO comprehension. We can see that some children, even though they have MLU scores at floor, actually with score zero, but they can still show their comprehension. So they have a person looking more than 50% at their matching side. And also they have the latency of first look, so they were able to look at the matching same maybe during so for less than 1.5 or for the first half of the test trials. So this means some proportion of minimally verbal children, they showed comprehension of SVO word order. So even though they are minimally verbal. So now let's summarize our results and talk about the role of a language faculty in autistic language acquisition. So in study 1, we found both TD children and children with SD showed comprehension of SVO word order, even though Mandarin allows variant word orders as well as null arguments. So this finding, our finding, is similar to the preserved SVO knowledge in English acquiring children with SD. And in study 2, we found both TD and ASD groups, they use perfective le and progressive zai to distinguish between completed and ongoing events. So when they heard le, they look at the completed events. When they heard zai, they look at ongoing events. Even though aspectual information not applied to surface in overt morphology in Mandarin Chinese. So this is also similar to the strengths in comprehending grammatical aspect in English acquiring children with SD. In study 3, we found ASD group comprehending object WH questions but not subject WH questions. But this pattern actually is similar with what we have found in English, Korean, and also previous studies in Mandarin acquiring high functioning children with SD. So they all demonstrate the ease of object over subject WH questions across languages in children with SD, despite their superficially distinct WH question structures. So compared with Mandarin acquiring TD children, we think that children with SD's grammatical acquisition follows similar acquisition patterns at typical development, although remember that these two groups are not matched on vocabulary, so they are delayed both in chronological age and expressive vocabulary. And also compared with English acquiring children with SD, we found more similarities than differences. So we find coherent patterns in comprehending core grammatical structures by children with SD acquiring English and also acquiring Chinese. So testifying that maybe similar underlying mechanisms are playing vital roles in grammatical acquisition of children with SD across languages. So because of our time limitation, we cannot extend this point, but we think maybe they have a knowledge of the setting of word order parameters, acquisition of functional morphemes, or universal operation of WH movement in their language acquisition. And also, we found that preschoolers with SDs deficits in language use. So especially previous studies suggested they have problems with producing grammatical aspect and WH questions. However, we found that they have a relative strength in comprehending grammatical aspect and at least object WH questions. So maybe their production problems do not represent universal grammatical impairments. So the production problems may stem primarily from social deficits inherent to the ASD diagnosis. So this observation is related to the fundamental distinction between linguistic competence and also linguistic performance. Especially we found some non-verbal children with SD, they have their linguistic competence. So even though they cannot behave, they cannot show they have this knowledge in their communication with people around. And also we found that dissociation between lexical versus grammar domains in ASD, because firstly, children with SD do not require a critical mass of vocabulary to develop their core grammatical knowledge. So grammatical strengths were found in our ASD population, especially in our Chinese population, whose vocabulary production abilities were dramatically delayed compared to the TD controls. So this is a new finding of Mandarin IPL studies. And also we found the lack of lexical grammatical correlation in the aspect and WH question studies. And also, as I mentioned, some of the minimally verbal children, they demonstrate hidden grammatical knowledge not overtly observed in their language production. So overall, we think we can see our data testify the operation of language faculty in autistic language acquisition. So language faculty contributes to the language acquisition of core grammar in children with SD across languages, like in Mandarin Chinese and also in previous English studies. And also language faculty observe grammatical development, which are is distinct from a social cognition system in SD, because remember, all these children with SD, they have problems with social communication. So we can see they have preserved the grammatical knowledge, and which differs from their social cognition system in ASD. And also children with SD's comprehension strengths versus production deficits testify the sharp contrast between linguistic competence, so maybe governed by the computational system of language faculty versus linguistic performance, maybe impaired by their impairments are in their sensory motor and the conceptual intentional interfaces. And also children with these grammatical strengths versus that disadvantages vocabulary production skills support the dissociation between lexicon and the grammar domains of the language faculty. And the implications, I think, are our study indicates that the language comprehension strengths in ASD may give us the important insight that many of them are acquiring language receptively. So even if they only produce limited speech. So especially we found minimally verbal children with SD, they still have hidden language understanding. And we also think comprehensive tasks, including both production and comprehension tasks, can provide a much clearer picture of strengths, challenges of children with SD. And also multidimensional and systematic measures are warranted to capture the full picture of language profiles of SD and to establish more effective individual tailored early language intervention paradigm. And we also think the in-depth study of language comprehension is only beginning. More grammatical structures are need to be investigated. And also we found slower sentence processing in our SVO studies, which means that we need to really maybe explore the language processing abilities in children with SD. So we also need to have corresponding intervention strategies. And also cross-linguistic studies are also warranted. And more studies are needed to understand the architecture of human language system. So to see the associated dissociation between linguistic subsystems and also linguistic other cognitive or neural systems. I would like to thank Professor Leticia Lagos, who helped to set up our IPL lab in Central South University. I thank Professor Stephen Crane for teaching me the importance of language faculty in language acquisition, and also Professor Ian Su for helping me finding a lot of children participants with SD. And also I thank research students, children families, and our colleagues for their support. And also thank you for your attention. Thank you for your participation in our webinar. For more details, you can look at our published paper in Evolutionary Linguistic Theory. Thank you for your attention.